Dobre day. Please remain standing for the playing of the Canadian and Ukrainian national anthem, sung by the Kurinya Ukrainian Folk Ensemble from Calgary and Ukrainian male chorus of Edmonton. I ask in observation of the COVID-19 public health guidelines outlined by Dr. Dina Henshaw, please remain from singing aloud. Well, welcome here. It's my absolute pleasure and honor to see you all here with us today. I'd like to welcome our special guests, the Honorable Jason Kenney, MLA for Calgary-Lougheed and the Premier of Alberta, Ms. Sarah Hoffman, MLA for Edmonton-Glenora, on behalf of the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Alexander Danilenko, Consul General of Ukraine in Edmonton, Ms. Arisha Boychuk, President of the Ukrainian Congress Alberta Council, the Clerk of the Legislative Assembly, Fathers, and with absolute no disrespect to the Premier or to Ms. Hoffman, but a very, very special guest, Mr. Leo Koronachuk, a Holodomor survivor. I'd also like to take a brief moment to acknowledge the presence of Darren Billis, the MLA for Edmonton, Beverly Clairview, and Ms. Jackie Armstrong Hominick, MLA for Fort Saskatchewan, Vegreville, two distinguished members of Ukrainian heritage. Welcome to the Alberta Legislature. My name is Nathan Cooper, and I have the honor and privilege of being the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta. And I'm honored to host this ceremony commemorating the Holodomor, one of the darkest periods in human history. For more than a decade, the Legislative Assembly has united with those of Ukrainian ancestry living in Alberta and around the world to admonish the act of genocide known as Holodomor. This man-made tragedy remains a prominent reminder that each of us has a responsibility to renounce acts of hate and defend human rights. This ceremony gives voice to the victims of Holodomor and ensures that the stories of the survivors are not forgotten. An estimated 10 million people died of starvation between 1932 and 1933. That number is so overwhelming that it's easy to forget that each death represents an individual with hopes and dreams, with loved ones, individual who had hoped to make significant contributions to our world, and their lives were cut short. Holodomor is a Ukrainian word that means extermination by starvation. The Soviet state masked the atrocity by calling it collectivization. Government-imposed food requisitions caused mass starvations. Farms and villages and whole towns were emptied of all locally produced food. Communist officials ransacked homes in search of everything edible, from vegetable crops to livestock to personal food stores. The population was starved to death. Yet businesses and markets were blocked from receiving shipments of food from elsewhere to ease the suffering. Those that tried to leave the region in search of food quickly found that all exits had been blocked and closed, that there was no escape. The famine was an assault on the Ukrainian identity. Soviet officials targeted Ukrainian communities, religious and political leaders and scholars. It was a campaign of repression and persecution. To this day, Holodomor remains one of the largest mass exterminations of civilians in history. Yet many are unaware of its existence. In 2008, Alberta's Legislative Assembly declared the fourth Saturday in November Ukrainian Famine and Genocide Holodomor Memorial Day. Each year since, we gather to draw attention to the atrocity, recognize the struggles endured by victims, and honor the resilience and incredible strength and spirit of the Ukrainian people. Those thousands and thousands of Ukrainian people that have made Alberta one of the best places to live and grow a community. It is on this day and every day that we are thankful for their efforts. Slava Ukraini, Slava Alberta. I would now like to invite the Honorable Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta, to bring remarks on behalf of the Government of Alberta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And let me say, Leo, how wonderful it is to see you joining us today. We gather to remember the unthinkable evil inflicted on the people of Ukraine during the Holodomor, the communist-planned famine that took the lives of millions in the genocide of 1932 and 1933. To English speakers, the word Holodomor may seem simple, but to those who speak Ukrainian, the word's profound directness captures the wanton disregard for human life that motivated this genocide. Holodomor is derived from moriti holodon, which means simply to kill by starvation. That was the reality for millions of people targeted by the communist policy to destroy the so-called kulaks, the small land-owning farmers, mainly in Ukraine, who resisted collectivization. There can be no doubts of its historical reality, despite continued efforts by Moscow and others to do so. It is chronicled and detailed by eyewitness accounts, and it is copiously evidenced by historical documents and archives. It was an all-out assault on Ukraine's people. The kulaks were forced to give up their land and join collective farms, from which all production was shipped out of the country. Food was removed from homes. Much of Ukraine was sealed off. People starved to death by the hundreds of thousands. Some were faced with unthinkable choices to survive. Dissidents, including intellectuals, political and religious leaders, were silenced by imprisonment and execution. Vasyl Rishko, a survivor of the Holodomor and author of the Ukrainian Holocaust of 1933, wrote, quotes, "This was the first instance of a peacetime genocide in history. It took the extraordinary form of an artificial famine deliberately created by the ruling power. This savage combination of words for the designation of a crime, an artificial, deliberately planned famine, is still incredible to many people throughout the world, but indicates the uniqueness of the crime of 1933, which is unparalleled for a time of peace in the number of victims that it claimed," unquote. The fourth Saturday in November is dedicated in Alberta and throughout Canada to honoring the memory of all those lost during this unspeakable crime against humanity. It is incumbent upon us to remember and to do so with intention. And that is why we stand with you, members of the Ukrainian community, today, to remember the lives of those that were stolen by the communist Soviet regime of Joseph Stalin. The targeted murder of these people who simply sought to live their lives in quiet dignity. As Vasyl Ovsienko said, quotes, "Ukrainians, being profoundly religious, believers in private property, and attached to their plots of land, were obviously unsuitable material for building communism, and this fact was noted by high-ranking Soviet officials. As a nation, we were subject to destruction. The remnants of the Ukrainian people were to become material for forming a new historical society, the Soviet people, with the Russian population, language, and culture at its core," unquote. And as we remember today, we must also recall that here in the democratic West, there were deliberate and sustained efforts to deny the historical reality of what was happening in 1932 and for the decades that followed. To this day, the New York Times celebrates the Pulitzer Prize awarded to Walter Duranty, who acted as one of the West's useful idiots in denying the clear evidence of the mass murder happening before his own eyes. But we also recall the brave counterexample of truth-tellers like Malcolm Muggeridge, who insisted on bringing the world's attention to Stalin's mass murder. I was honored to declare the Government of Canada's recognition of the genocidal nature of Holodomor in 2008 in the presence of then-President Yushchenko, and I will never forget representing Canada at the solemn 75th anniversary commemoration of the genocide in Kiev in 2008, at the opening of Ukraine's National Holocaust Memorial. As snow gently fell, thousands gathered holding red votive candles and prayed as the Byzantine choir chanting the haunting requiem, Vishnaya Pamyat. So let us prayerfully call to mind the sacred memory of the millions of lives that were taken in this unspeakable act of evil. Eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord, and may light perpetual shine upon them. Vichnaya pamyat, memory eternal, Vichnaya pamyat.
Thank you very much, Premier. I would now like to invite Sarah Hoffman, the MLA for Edmonton-Glenora, to bring greetings on behalf of the Leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Honored guests, and specifically and particularly to Mr. Koronik, thank you so much for being here today as we take a few moments to pause and reflect on the atrocities. I want to recognize that we're on Treaty 6 territory, a place that's always very closely connected to the Métis people of Alberta, who helped many of my great-grandparents and many of our great-grandparents come here and settle and be part of the vibrancy that we have today in Alberta. I'm honored to be here today on behalf of the official opposition to commemorate Holodomor Memorial Day, which marks one of the world's most horrendous tragedies, characterized by unspeakable acts of torture. Genocide is an attempt to destroy a culture by murdering its people, and the Holodomor was nothing less. It is beyond comprehension and yet remains true that the Soviet government orchestrated a region-wide famine to oppress Ukrainian people. Holodomor is death by starvation. And we condemn the Holodomor and the systemic human rights violations Ukrainian people endured between 1932 and 33. Soviet police took more than food. They denied the basic needs of an entire population. They took personal possessions, land, and homes. Survival of those conditions was almost impossible, and to make matters worse, death was seemingly the only way out. The borders were closed to all who tried to escape, and estimates are that tens of thousands of people died each and every day, while 1.7 million tons of grain were exported to Western markets. The Soviet government used starvation as a political weapon to force Ukrainians to succumb to Stalin's rule. The horrendous 2-year campaign of terror was organized to force compliance and conformity by dissolving any sense of Ukrainian culture, community, or nationalism. But Stalin failed. He underestimated the resiliency of Ukrainian people, and that spirit was not broken. The culture did not fade. Ukrainian Albertans here have long called this place home and have contributed to our province's success. Perhaps we are best known for turning simple ingredients into amazing culinary delights, but the contributions of Ukrainian Albertans are certainly integrated into all facets of our society. There would be no high-level bridge if it weren't for the newcomers of Ukrainian descent. Much of our province's agricultural success began with hardworking Ukrainian homesteaders clearing the land, and of course, the culture lives on. So today, and on November 26th, which is Holodomor Memorial Day in Alberta, we ask that Albertans take a few moments to acknowledge the tragedy, acknowledge the suffering. Every person who died was loved, they were special in their own right, and they deserve to be remembered. And we must all work together to ensure that horrific acts like the Holodomor never happen again. Vichnaya pamya, Vichnaya pamya, Vichnaya pamya.
Thank you, Ms. Hoffman. I'd now like to invite the Consul General of Ukraine in Edmonton, Mr. Danilenko, for his commemoration.
Honorable Premier Jesse Kenney, Honorable Speaker Nathan Cooper, MLAs, Владика Іларіон, дорога українська громада, дорогий пане Леоніде Коровник, свідок Голодомору, велика шана, ladies and gentlemen. These days are incredibly sad days for us, for all Ukrainians around the globe. These days, with the deep sorrow in our hearts, we commemorate millions of innocent victims of Holodomor. one of the most terrible crimes in the history of humankind, deliberately planned and executed in Ukraine by the Soviet regime of Joseph Stalin. Millions of Ukrainians, innocent men, women, children, died from artificial starvation. Just in 1 year, hundreds of flourishing Ukrainian villages with peaceful peasants were turned into a dead land. Ukrainians were doomed to the slow, agonizing death just because they wanted to be free on their own land, peacefully grow crops and their children. They just wanted to speak their native language, remember their own history, and honor their heroes. They simply wanted to be Ukrainians. But Soviet regime could not allow it. In their eyes, it was a deadly crime to be free, immediate threat to the Stalin communist system. Soviets wanted that everyone on the territory of the Soviet Union to be an impersonal Soviet citizen, blindly loyal to the regime, citizen who has forgotten his own language and history and doesn't ask any questions. But that was not the case with Ukrainians. Ukrainians had always fought for their freedom and dignity. They had always been a threat to the communist regime. Right after the October 1917 upheaval, Ukraine proclaimed its independence. Ukrainian farmers refused to join collective farms. They just wanted to remain owners of their own land. When Soviets understood that Ukrainians would never give up, they decided to punish them to death. The decision led to suffering, pain, grief, and death in Ukraine on horrific scale. We probably will never know the real number of the victims because the regime diligently concealed all evidence of the crime and prevented the dissemination of the information about it. But sooner or later, the truth always comes out. And that truth about Holodomor horrified the world. Reacting to the revealed information, many countries and separate jurisdictions around the globe recognized Holodomor as an act of genocide. And of course, Canada and Alberta are among them. In 2008, Canada and the province of Alberta recognized the Holodomor as an act of genocide and proclaimed the official Holodomor Memorial Day. On behalf of Ukrainian people, I would like to extend our words of gratitude to Canadian federal government and the Parliament, as well as to the provincial government and Legislative Assembly of Alberta for this recognition, for being today with us commemorating the victims of this tragedy. It's very important for us Ukrainians. We highly appreciate your understanding and strong support. I also would like to say words of gratitude to the Ukrainian community. You made tremendous work to make the Canadian society aware of Holodomor, to make this recognition happen. You gathered tons of evidence. You made many historical researches to disclose the truth about Holodomor. You spoke loudly about it. And I am proud that due to your initiative and hard work, first ever Holodomor monument was erected here in Edmonton in 1983 to bring the world's attention to this tragedy. Let us not forget. Вечная память.
Thank you, Mr. Danilenko. I'd now like to invite Arisha Boychuk, the president of the Ukraine-Canadian Congress Alberta Provincial Council, to bring her remarks.
Holodomor survivor pan Leonid Korovnik, pani Natalia Talenchuk, children of survivors Nathan Korovnik and Orysia Talenchuk, Premier Honorable Jason Kenney, Honorable Nathan Cooper, Speaker of the House, of the Legislative Assembly, MLAs, Excellencio, His Grace Bishop Ilarion, Father Billy, Prepodobny Utsi I Sestre, Mr. Alexander Danilenko, Consul General of Ukraine, ladies and gentlemen, and dear children. On behalf of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress and the Ukrainian community in Alberta, I am honored to be here today to commemorate those who lost their lives in this senseless genocide in Ukraine's history, and to express to the government of Alberta our gratitude for developing, accepting, and recognizing annually the Ukrainian Famine and Genocide Holodomor Memorial Day Act. Home to over 365,000 individuals of Ukrainian heritage, Alberta has been a leader in helping our community and let the world know we have not and will not forget the single greatest catastrophe endured by Ukraine during Soviet rule, the Holodomor. This was not just a general tragedy of the area. This was part of Stalin's campaign against Ukrainian nationalism. This was murder by starvation. In 1953, Rempel Lemkin, known as the father of the United Nations Convention on Genocide, described the 1932 and 1933 famine in Soviet Ukraine as a classic example of Soviet genocide. He went on to say, if the Soviet program succeeds completely, if intelligentsia, the priests and the peasants, can be eliminated, Ukraine will be dead as if every Ukrainian was killed. For it will have lost that part of which has kept and developed its culture, its beliefs, its common ideas, which have guided it and given it a soul. In short, made it a nation. This is not simply a case of mass murder. It is a case of genocide, of the destruction not of individuals only, but a culture and a nation. However, Ukraine's culture, its beliefs, its common ideas, which have guided it and given it a soul, endured. At the height of Holodomor, Ukrainians were dying 25,000 per day, 1,000 per hour, 17 per minute. The importance of commemorations such as today is that now they carry even a greater significance, as Russia continues to deny this genocide and suggests that the Holodomor was just a result of difficult circumstances during that time period. And it's events like today that will serve as reminders that the world, that Canadians, and that Albertans know differently. Historical realities which are well documented and events like today help to educate in order to ensure that such genocides are no longer a part of our world history on any continent. The first Ukrainians to draw attention to the tragedy of the Holodomor were survivors who fled to the West. They were initially dismissed by much of the Western political and intellectual establishments. Nonetheless, they continued their efforts in decades that follow, and all of them, those who now have passed, those who are still with us, and the children of survivors. Our Ukrainian community and our society owes a great debt of gratitude for your persistence and ability to continue reliving a time of your life I am certain you would sooner forget. The world remembers, Ukraine remembers, the world acknowledges. Вічна я пам'ять. Дякую.
Thank you, Ms. Boychuk. Ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to invite our very special guest, Mr. Leo Koronik, to the podium. Mr. Koronik is a Holodomor survivor who now resides in Edmonton, and he will read his poem entitled Remember Famine Genocide.
Remember famine, genocide. At times, I sit alone and meditate about the world, the human race, chaotic history, uncertain fate, and shadows hide my downcast face. For in Ukraine there was a restless sky, yet independence she proclaimed. There was great joy in every eye. Long live our country, all exclaimed. And yet my country's future was not bright. On the horizon, stormy clouds, a sign there may not be real peace in sight. Instead, uncertainty and doubts. For Russia always was our neighbor foe, engaging in a cunning ploy, thus causing wretchedness and much great woe. She thought her gift was to destroy. So 1930 was the start, to liquidate the Kulak class, and Stalin acted with a stony heart, did more evil, nevertheless, sent 250,000 of our people east, and thousands died while going there. Still others, while in exile, were deceased. If some survived, lived in despair. And then, in 1931, horrific deeds were taking place. A fearful sight. Great famine had begun, but Stalin tried to save his face. 150,000 starved to death, but that was nothing. What would come? What you will hear may take away your breath or even make your body numb. For Kremlin agents and the troops have gone to peasants' homes with clubs and arms to plunder them with zest like Genghis Khan, then drank and danced in burning barns. Thus myriads of such Kremlins, rank and file, like pythons coiled around our chest to choke our life and all our land defile and poison into hearts ingest. Our world was tumbling like an old brick wall, thus causing ruin and despair. Exhausted people could not walk, but crawl. It was a yawning, open hell. So 3 years passed of hungry nights and days, of Kremlins shedding blameless blood. All of Ukraine was in shock and daze. disease, and death came like a flood. 10 million people starved to death. Our fathers, mothers, children, youth, he took away God-given life and breath. He hated God and us and truth. His mission was to see our country die. But we resolved to save our land. He tried to kill us, jail, and crucify. We kept our sword in our hand. We called the world, please come. We starve. Help us. They heard us well, and yet passed by. Then said, why do these people fret and fuss? We shrugged, but did not blink an eye. Though many decades came and now have gone, the memory still lingers on. And now we honor those who loved Ukraine till death, for they believed in her undying breath. Dear God, all those who died of famine, genocide, grant them eternal rest. May they in peace abide.
Thank you so very much. It is a touching moment that I think we should all take a moment to breathe in. In memory of victims of Holodomor, we will now light candles. We'll invite the Premier, followed by Mr. Danilenko, and then Mr. Koronik. They will each light candles individually. Whilst the candles are being lit, we will be accompanied by the playing of Vichnia Payamat, performed by the children of St. Martin's Ukrainian Children's String Society. At the conclusion of the music, I will invite us all to rise for a moment of silence. Please rise for a moment of silence. Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, in closing, I extend my sincere gratitude to my fellow participants and, in particular, to the children of the St. Martin's Ukrainian Children's String Society. What is more powerful in the Ukrainian spirit than the children of the generations of Ukrainians who have come before? It is those generations that these children will stand on the shoulders of and carry on the great traditions, the great memories, and the incredible sacrifices and contributions. And so from the bottom of my heart, thank you, boys and girls, for joining us here today. In particular, thank you, Leo. Today is a day I will not soon forget as I think about your very, very touching words as we reflect upon the most horrific of all actions. Alberta is home to some 370,000 people of Ukrainian ancestry, some of whom are Holodomor survivors and descendants. We give voice to the victims of the Holodomor and ensure that the stories and survivors will continue to be shared throughout our annual ceremony. It is incumbent upon each and every one of us to openly renounce acts of hate and actively protect human rights, both past and present. And while today, and in particular this Saturday, as we commemorate the atrocities of the Holodomor, we also celebrate the spirit, the overcoming spirit of the Ukrainian people. Well, the atrocities are just that. We celebrate the light of tomorrow that lives in each and every Ukrainian because of the memories that we have, but the hope for a better tomorrow. Thank you all so very much for joining us today. May God bless Ukraine. May God bless Alberta.